Hi, I'm Frank Cespedes. I teach at Harvard's Business School, and I'm the author of a new book, Sales Management That Works: How to Sell in a World That Never Stops Changing. Best piece of advice that I ever got about this topic was years ago, a case study that I wrote. A senior executive told me, Frank, watch what happens. Marketing and sales in most companies is managed the way it should have been managed 5 to 10 years in the past in that industry, because that's the last time the people who are making the really important marketing decisions, the senior executives, actually had contact with customers. Thank you.
Welcome to the Inside Sales Show, hosted by Phil Gerbershak. Each episode will take you behind the scenes with a sales expert or a sales practitioner and go inside the nuances you need to be successful today in sales and sales leadership. We'll have conversations about the mindset, skill set, and tool set of highly successful sales professionals, offer insights into prospecting, qualifying, following up, closing sales for inside sales professionals, and hiring, firing, motivation, and rewarding your team for inside sales leaders. And we will find out what's working and what's not working for inside sales pros right now. And now, here's your host of the Inside Sales Show, sales speaker, sales trainer, and pinball wizard, Phil Gerbershak.
Hey, what's up, everyone? I'm so excited to talk to somebody who actually gets sales management. Today, I'm talking with Frank Cespedes, all about his new book, Sales Management That Works. This is going to be so awesome. I'm super excited and super glad he's here. Frank, welcome to the show, man. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Phil, for having me on the show. I'm a fan. You give practical, relevant advice. Happy to be here.
Cool. So first question I've got, Tom Brady's in Tampa now. Are you still a fan, or are you a Patriots fan first?
I'm still a fan. He's still the GOAT, the greatest of all time. You folks are lucky, but heck, we had 20 years, 20-1.
Yeah, absolutely. We're grateful he's down here. I'm from Green Bay area. I love my Packers. I love Favre. I love Rodgers. But I got to tell you, though, props to Tom. Tom Brady is the GOAT. No question about it. So cool, man. So congrats on a great book. First of all, I have to say that, because seldom do I find a book that is laid out so easily and set up so well for our conversation, Frank. Well done.
Well, Phil, flattery will get you everywhere. Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. It's true, man. So I love that you shared that bit of advice, because it is so valuable and so relevant to the conversation back when they were actually making decisions 5 years ago. Well, they were practicing as a marketer then. And now finally they got promoted, and now we're in the C-level, and now it's like, oh, well, what worked 5 years ago? Let's do that. No, that's wrong, man. So why do we do that?
Well, look, you'll see some of the data I'm about to cite in the book, but that bit of advice that I got over 25 years ago, which took me a little while to really understand the wisdom there, has become a bigger issue. Just some data for the audience. If you look at the global 1,000, the 1,000 biggest firms in the world, the number of executives reporting to the CEO has doubled in the last 20 years. But then if you ask yourself, who are these people? Where did they come from? What did they do before they became senior executives? The reality is that very few of them were running a line of business or were general managers in the traditional sense. They're specialists, the CIO, the CMO, data analytics, etc. Now, why is that? It's not because companies wake up and say, oh boy, let's be siloed and bureaucratic. It's because business has gotten more complex. You need more specialists. But the point is that fewer people than ever before have made it to the C-suite, including CEO, with sales and marketing as part of their prolonged background. So that is a big deal and a growing deal.
Wow, that's interesting. I had a CEO that was a CFO and was never in sales, never in marketing. Very different experience than a lot of what I've seen is successful, to your point, because the focus is on something else, right? The focus is on maybe, I don't know, defense, right? On cost cutting. instead of revenue growth, right?
Yeah. Yeah. By the way, if you look at the Heidrick and Struggles data about who's in the C-suite, the CEO position, you're exactly right. Now, the single biggest group are people with a finance background.
Interesting. Interesting. Wow. Wow. That's interesting. So we're fighting against that as a salesperson, right? And by fighting, I don't mean necessarily physically or anything, but that's a different mindset. That's a very different mindset of finance than it is of sales or marketing. So how does that affect, or how does that align, I guess, with the new sales process that you suggest in your book?
Well, I mean, the basic point is this, and this is what both people in the field in sales and people in the C-suite need to deal with. The most important thing about selling in any market is the buyer. Who buys, why, and how. And the how part of buying has changed dramatically in the last 10 to 15 years. And technology has been a big part of that change. Buyers no longer go through this linear sequential funnel pipeline. Think about all the metaphors we use, everything that's built into virtually every CRM system. Buyers are now online and offline at multiple points throughout their buying journey. It is not online or offline for the vast majority of companies. You've got to deal with both, and that has a lot of implications. It doesn't mean the disappearance of the salesperson. That's a myth. The number of salespeople in the United States has increased consistently throughout the 21st century, even as bandwidth increases, et cetera. But it changes dramatically sales tasks, what a sales manager needs to do, and because of the increased data and the fact that you've got more and more finance people looking at that data, it is also increasing the requirements for financial literacy in sales above and beyond the top line.
Ooh, so that's interesting, because I think that I've been seeing that shift to more understanding the business more holistically than just understanding sales, understanding how the product fits in, the real solution of your product. Super important. So with what's going on right now, with the fact that so many are working from home and maybe never going back to work from the office, how does this change things? Is this more important or less important than it was?
Oh, I think it's more important, but let me give you my take, which I think, frankly, is not completely in agreement with the current conventional wisdom. I mean, obviously, when stores are closed or limited to 25 to 50% of their capacity, or when people feel that if they go to a store or travel someplace, they may catch a virus and die, obviously you're going to have more online buying and virtual selling. But if you look at the data through the pandemic in the United States, the maximum lockdown conditions thus far, let's cross our fingers about these variants, was the second quarter of 2020. And during the second quarter of 2020, e-commerce as a percentage of retail sales increased less than 5%, and it trended down the rest of the year. So I think the notions that, everything's going online, it's all about virtual selling, I think those are way, way overblown. But I do think a couple of things are real. One is the proliferation of media in conjunction with the pandemic, people at home, has made access harder to get. So reps need to be even better at their sales conversations in the limited time they have with prospects, whether it's online or a person-to-person. The second thing, and I think this is the sales management and senior executive issue, in effect, what the pandemic has demonstrated to companies is that, to put it bluntly, they were overpaying for certain tasks in their sales models. Things, for example, like lead generation. Turns out you can have less expensive people do that, sometimes even an algorithm. Demos, you can do a number of demos online. Meetings, there are a number of meetings that you can also do virtually. I don't think that recognition is going to go away even after we're all vaccinated.
Yeah. So that's interesting, right? As
Excuse me.
companies, yeah. So as companies are overpaying for those certain tasks, as they think about how do we migrate that back, right? How do we go back to making sure that that's a fair wage, not an overpriced wage, but a fair wage? You mentioned sales development, you meant lead generation, if you will.
Yeah.
You mentioned demos, you mentioned some meetings. So what about sales management, right? Like what about them? Is there anything that they do, Frank, that maybe can be reallocated or maybe even removed from their process?
Well, I think the basic responsibility of sales managers is to manage. And to do that, you've got to be in touch with the way buying and therefore selling requirements are working today, not yesterday, right? Nobody ever made a lot of money in business just singing songs about the good old days. In business, the arrow of time only points forward. Yesterday was yesterday. And that is changing for the reasons I mentioned earlier, buying, and the pandemic in effect has accelerated some of those trends. Now, what can sales managers do to achieve, quite rightly, the goals, Phil, that you're outlining? Well, one thing is they shouldn't overpay for certain tasks. Where are the areas where, in effect, we can use marketing or service or the computer to do things that we're now asking our salespeople to do? Let me cite a bit of data here to give you a sense of the magnitude of the opportunity. If you ask yourself, how much time does the average salesperson spend in customer contact? And by customer contact, I don't simply mean, making a product pitch either in person or online. I mean all forms of customer contact, email, demos, webinars, etc. And the number obviously varies by company and industry, but in the aggregate, it's about 30 to 35%. Now, think about the impact on most businesses if you can make that 40%, 45%, 50%. In most businesses, that's not only a huge productivity improvement, it also increases the addressable market because segments that were uneconomic to reach now become economic. That's what sales managers get paid to do. And frankly, that's what the finance-oriented CEO should be keeping her eyes and ears on.
So that's so interesting because I've seen that stat too, right? So about a third of their time is spent actually engaged in customer contact, which means that two-thirds of the time, right? If we take an average 8-hour day, we're only looking at about let's call it 3 hours a day that are customer contact. So things like booking calendar appointments, we should not be dinking around going back and forth. And buyers are getting used to that now. I mean, before, I will tell you, like a year and a half ago, I had a lot of people that would say, well, I'm put off if you send me a link to your calendar. Well, if I send it too soon now, of course, that still ticks people off. But hey, if you say you want to meet, you don't want to squirt around with my calendar or yours and waste time, right? Like you want to look what's good for you, not what's good for me, right? What's good for you. And then here we go. And so that's one I see really easily that we can, that's honestly in my case, that's an hour, at least an hour every other day. So 3 hours a week on that stuff. I mean, that's great. What are some of those other tasks, Frank? And then let's move into these things.
But again, you got it exactly right. That is the logic you want to apply. And think about some of the things that companies had to do and still are doing during the pandemic simply out of necessity. Lowering the friction after the sale is made, right? The electronic signatures from DocSend, et cetera. If you look at the research that's been done about that just in the last year, it's astounding how much time that alone frees up. Again, other things we can do to increase that 1 hour a day. And again, people tend to forget the basics. One of the things I've learned Once upon a time, Phil, I looked like Jimi Hendrix. Look at me now. But one of the things I've learned working with businesses for 30 years, it is amazing how far doing the fundamentals better than your competitors can get you. In most businesses, and by most, I mean something close to your body temperature, about 98.6%. In most businesses, there's a very high correlation between the number of calls that the rep makes and actual sales. That's why the time issue and whatever you can do to increase that incrementally is so important.
Wow. That's so good. So I dig that, and I think that's important, right? Focusing on real productivity gains to be more profitable makes so much sense. So superstars, let's talk about them, right? So I love that in your book that you say that superstardom, star salespeople, it's not portable. So talk to us about that, Frank, because when you say it in your book, it just makes so much obvious sense, but nobody ever says that.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, they do quite the opposite. They chase the stars fruitlessly. But first, it's important to understand that of all the functions in business, sales is the most context specific, right? Selling software is different than selling consumer durables, is different than selling professional services. Selling in North America is different than selling in Latin America, Asia, etc. Very context specific. And that's why superstardom is not easily portable. Most companies, have the experience of hiring that person who was a star at, fill in the blanks. She gets to our place and somehow she doesn't perform the same way. Now, it's not as though that person suddenly got stupid or lost their individual capabilities. But selling effectiveness depends not only on that person's skills externally with customers, it almost always depends as well on the internal relationships that they've developed with other important people in their company, service, delivery, etc. And when you hire a star from company A, he or she has to recreate that all over again. And one of the jobs of management is to accelerate that process to help them do that.
Wow. That's so obvious to me that finding the smoothest path to success is so important. Like if the first time somebody sends you an email out of the blue, even if they're work with you, you're like, who is this? What do they do? How can I help them? Why are they bothering me? Do I need to respond? Is this for somebody else? I ask myself 10 questions, and then over time, I can just, hey, Frank, I got a question. Oh, yeah. Hey, dude, what's up? How can I help you? And everything else gets shut out. And it's so interesting that we forget that we miss that we don't do that as a leader. So give us some practical stuff here, Frank. How can a leader shorten that cycle up more?
Well, again, they've got to understand what are the important tasks in their sales model today, not yesterday. And by the way, this is an area, the other thing that's going on, the other motivation for the book, we're living through a sustained data revolution in sales. And this will continue, Phil, throughout our lifetimes and careers. And that data revolution has a number of impacts. One is, as I mentioned earlier, finance gets the data, and finance people, they're annoying. Once they get the data, they start to ask questions. That's why financial literacy is more important. But the other thing that's going on right now in many, many sales organizations is that they're flooded with the data, the vast majority of which are interesting but marginal factoids. What the sales manager needs to do is focus on, and I always use the metaphor of a handful, 5 things, those things that really make a difference. And then that's what should drive hiring, training and development, compensation, how you allocate the tasks, etc. It will be, again, context specific. Because selling at company A is almost always different than selling at company B, even if it's the same industry, because their strategies vary. And again, once I say this, you'll nod, others watching us will nod, but they forget it. In business, despite all these other books you read, there is no such thing as performance in the abstract, especially in sales. There's only performance here in our company with our products. That's what we need to focus on, and those tasks.
Okay. Okay. So I get that. So how do we hire for that though? How do we hire when they've done task A this way
Yeah.
and now they need to do task A this way? I mean, what questions do we ask, or how do we get in that way? Because I know you go through this in the book, but give us some tips on how we can get started at least along that path.
Well, let me step back a bit, give all our viewers some advice about what not to do, and then some tips. The first thing to recognize is that hiring in sales presents challenges that simply don't exist to the same extent in other functions, right? For example, if you want to hire an engineer, you can go to a school, and it's a little bit like walking into a buffet. I mean, what are you interested in? Electrical engineering, chemical engineering? Would you like it with ice cream? They all minor in environmental engineering. If you want to hire someone in finance or accounting, you can find people that majored in those subjects. The same is true for computer programmers. But of the nearly 5,000 colleges and universities in America, last time I looked, which was less than 2 years ago when I started writing this book, less than 200 even had a sales course, let alone a sales program. So this is an area of business where the vast majority of people start out knowing almost nothing about what they're going to get paid for. Then in the hiring process, many companies make a tough job even tougher. There's a dramatic over-reliance on unstructured interviews in hiring people. And sales is the ultimate performance art. It's about behavior. It's not about how they smiled in the interview. It's not simply about their attitude. So those are two things that have to be recognized. Then what are the tips? I have colleagues who are familiar with this research, which is very consistent, and their advice is therefore don't interview. My own feeling is it's only someone who's never managed a business that can take that advice seriously. Of course you interview. People manage people. People work with people, right? So they're not algorithms, but you've always got to supplement the individual interviews and make them more structured. That's comment number one. Comment number two, it's about behavior, right? Internship type of opportunities, things you can do to observe and manage that behavior. And then the third thing is don't rely, and again, I hope my dean doesn't hear this, but there's a huge over-reliance on degrees, on parchment. And again, talent in sales in particular comes in all shapes and sizes. It does not correlate with the degree from prestigious school X or the MBA or whatever. And the management job is to pick that out of the mass. So those would be my headlines about that very, very important topic.
Wow. So supplementing them to make them more structured, supplement those interviews. I think that's great, right? Focus on the behaviors and get examples if you can, right, of those behaviors, how they play out, how they've happened, right? Tell me about your day, what your typical day might be, and
No. I'm going farther than that. It's not tell me about your day. It's can I observe your day? Can I see what you do?
How do I do that in an interview though?
You don't. That's the point. You've got to supplement the interviews. There's a major over-reliance on interviews.
No, with what then? With what though? I mean, how do I observe that behavior?
Internship possibilities, right? We already put people on performance improvement plans for 90 days. You can also manage the hiring that way as well. You can, inside sales. All right. I listen to you when you deal in customer discovery calls or et cetera. There are lots of ways to do this. The reliance on interviews is a lazy way of going at this. And it's also a way, most people, when I show them this data, and again, I have to insist on this, Phil, this is 60 years of consistent results. The correlations between the evaluations people get in their interviews and their actual behavior on the job tends to vary from 0.1 to 0.4. In other words, even in the best of circumstances, it's less than the 50-50 odds of flipping a coin. And in service jobs like sales, it's closer to 0.1. And yet, when I tell this to executives, it's a little bit like the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. Their first response is to deny it. Well, okay, here, let me show you the research. Then they sort of get angry with the person who said this. But then the third part is what in the stages of grief they call the exceptionalism. Yeah, this is true for you and it's true for him, but not me. I'm a horse whisperer. I know how to peer into people's souls during an interview. No, you don't. The odds are very, very low that you know how to do that. So you got to get beyond the interview.
Wow. So I'll tell you, Frank, I've never, ever had to do that. I've interviewed for many sales jobs. I've interviewed many salespeople. I've never, I don't even know how I would ask someone, hey, you want to do a 3-month internship with us before we hire you? I mean, is that like, I don't know. I don't know that I would leave a job leave for a job like that. I mean, that just seems that seems very, very different, right? Very challenging.
Try it and see what happens. Number one. Number two, don't we in effect do that when we hire people, even if we don't call it an internship? Turnover in sales varies annually from 20 to 30%, Phil. It's lower during a pandemic when people of talent don't have as many opportunities. And watch what happens in the next year or two. It's higher when they've got more opportunities. But think about that, 20 to 30%. That means the average sales force needs, in effect, to recreate itself, hire everyone, train everyone every 3 to 5 years. How many salespeople, in effect, get washed out in the first 6 months? Now, you don't call that an internship. You call it, well, I learned who can work and who can't. But that's what it is. Why not be honest about it?
I gotcha. Okay. All right. I see that. Okay. We do that. That makes sense. To your point, that totally makes sense, right? So they're going to get training. I'm going to observe what they're doing. We're going to have real metrics. Yeah. Okay. All right. I buy that. That makes sense. I understand now. So, okay. So we don't have time to go deep on a ton more stuff here, but I want to talk to you a little bit about the partnership and how that's so important now, because you talk about 5 P's in your book. You talk about people, process, pricing, partners, productivity. We covered some people, we covered productivity, but let's talk about partners and how important those are now more than ever.
Well, yeah, and by partners, I basically mean, and again, I'm not religious about what jargon we use, but I mean channel partners, ecosystem partners, etc. Because buyers are both online and offline, simultaneously during their buying journeys, these debates, which I consider these sterile sort of Oxford University debates, should we be online? Should we be in person? The answer to that question in the third decade of the 21st century is yes, all right? We need to do both. But this is a big deal in sales. Because when salespeople have selling responsibilities as well as working with channel partners, they also have to manage. And that's a tough transition in most people's careers, but especially in sales. Most salespeople are individual contributors. They value their autonomy. I made my numbers, leave me alone, right? Now they've got to work with all these others. That's a very, very big deal and a big challenge in most organizations. But, it's what I tell CEOs. The fact that something is important to do, but tough to do, a real pain in the neck to do, doesn't mean we don't do it. because it's still important and we better learn how to do it. There's a big challenge in many sales organizations.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. I mean, I never considered that, right? That working with a partner is not working with a peer, right? It is a management situation because I need to get productivity out of them. I need to get results. I need to get reporting. I need to understand what they're doing. And I'm not, I hadn't considered
And
that.
let's face it, depending on the partner, most of them don't wake up in the morning and the first thing they think about is your company or that salesperson. You're also constantly fighting for awareness and attention.
Yeah, for sure. Well, for sure, right? Because likely, if they're a channel partner, they're not just a channel partner with you. They've probably
Yeah,
got other channel
exactly.
partnerships, right? They've got streams much like our buyers do, right? They've moved also from a funnel to a stream. So we have to market to them. We have to have meetings with them. We need to stay in front of them. We need to feed them. We need to, continue to do that. And to that point, I would bet you're probably going to say yes, but do we also then need that 90-day gestation period before we get into deep partnership with them?
Well, those tend to be more, legal agreements, et cetera. But I think the implication there is, and I think you've got it exactly right. I think the implications are twofold. One is choose carefully, because notice this is a lot of effort, and most sales organizations, obviously have limited capacity. And the second thing, and again, once one says this, it sounds so obvious, but so many people forget it. No channel partnership, no matter how well designed, no matter how much it's a fit, no channel partnership manages itself. It must be actively and proactively managed. And, you're just not going to do that with everyone. So choose carefully.
Wow. Well, it sounds like we need to choose our salespeople carefully, our sales managers carefully, and even, yes, our channel partners
Yeah,
carefully.
and I think the reason why, and this gets us back to your first question about, the CEO, if you add up the numbers in most companies, if you add up the numbers involved in hiring, fully burdened compensation, the comp, the benefits, the incentives, et cetera, and in training and development, companies spend 20% more per capita on sales training than any other function. That number annually in most companies is bigger than their biggest CapEx, capital expenditure decisions, but it rarely gets the same rigorous attention that buying software does. That's why we need to do it carefully.
That's so interesting. That's so interesting, Frank, because many of the organizations I've been in have not maybe they just don't call it training, right? Maybe they don't have a training department, but I think what happens a lot of times is they go looking outside for skills instead of inside
Yeah.
for development.
Yeah.
And that's where that happens, right? It's $1,000 here and $1,500 there and $2,000 there, right? And it dribs and drabs instead of plunk, right? Here's what we're paying for a rent every month.
Yeah, and Phil, I think you're right about practice. And notice, let's get back to the stardom is not easily portable issue. That's a false trade-off. This notion that I hire someone with a lot of experience, therefore I don't have to spend money on training and development. You do, because performance is only performance in your company. You shouldn't give a damn about their performance, in someone else's company. You're hiring them because you believe they can do it here.
Yeah, for sure, right? Past performance is not indicative of future results.
And now the financial folks got that part right, even when they don't mean it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Frank, you dropped a lot of smart bombs today. We talked so much about good stuff, right? About how access is harder to get, how we've got to be both online and offline. We talked about the 30 to 35% of time that salespeople spend and how it's our job as sales leaders to maximize that, get more productivity out of them, that superstardom isn't portable. You talked about those, focusing on the 5 things that make a difference and how to hire better, even partnering up, really important. But if there was one other thing that you could share with people, if they're looking to, man, Frank, you gave us so much, how do I get started? What would that be?
Yeah, this is my standard advice. My advice to get started, make sure that your sales managers take performance reviews seriously and know how to do good performance reviews. Most sales managers, because they're busy, do these very, what I call cursory drive-by reviews that are not really reviews. They're more or less compensation discussions. And that's bad for two reasons. One is it perpetuates a culture of underperformance. And secondly, and this is a big, big issue coming out of the pandemic, whatever else the pandemic has demonstrated, it demonstrated painfully for many companies the importance of cash. Most of the really important information about who buys why and how is locked in the cranium of individual account managers. You only get at that through a good review. So when managers do poor reviews, they're also blocking the flow of critical information. And this is a trainable skill. In the company I ran, I waited 4 years before I got my people trained on this. And that was 4 years too long to wait.
Wow. Wow. I absolutely see that's true, Frank. That is clear. Performance reviews are not taken seriously, not done very well, and therefore they're not very useful. So great spot to end here. We're going to do this again, Frank. We got to go deeper. This is a great book. I'm super excited. I really know this will help folks. So folks, if you're listening, if you're watching, Sales Management That Works, you need to get a copy of. It is fantastic. It is so full, and it is step by step. Frank has laid it out for you to get going. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it pretty much wherever books are sold. But Frank, thank you so much for dropping so much good stuff with us today. I really appreciate it.
Phil,
really
I thank you very, very much. Really.
My pleasure. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, everyone, for listening, for watching.